Good evening, friends. Welcome to a rather chilly night by Miami standards. I'm glad you came out with an extra layer or two on, maybe. My name is Phil Harling. I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities here at and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment of the Henry King Stanford Distinguished Professor Series in the Humanities, a series that's been going on for a while, and presumably will continue to do so for long into the future. I have a few people I want to express my gratitude to before I introduce the distinguished colleague who's going to introduce our speaker this evening. So I'd like to thank the Dean of Libraries, Chuck Ekman, and our friends here at the beautiful Kislak Center for the use of this very handsome space on yet another occasion. I'd like to thank the Center for the Humanities staff who've been working hard and diligently to make this a great evening for everybody concerned. And that is Christina Larson, our Assistant Director, Oni Dunham, our Conference Coordinator, our UGRO Graduate Fellow, Vanessa Barcelos, our Student Assistants, Lyric Johnson and Layla Blue Jackson Yanez. Now tonight's talk is a joint venture between the Center for the Humanities and UM's brand new George P. Hanley Democracy Center. And the director of the Hanley Center is Professor Greg Koger, who's going to introduce our special guest this evening. Greg Koger is a professor of political science here at who specializes in legislative politics and political parties. Greg is the author of numerous articles and books and is a leading expert on the American political art of the filibuster, and the author of, among many other titles, Filibustering, A Political History of Obstruction in the House and Senate, published in 2010 by the University of Chicago Press. So Greg is presumably capable of speaking for a very long time, but he assures me he's not going to do that this evening. So without any further ado, I give you Greg Koger to introduce our special guest tonight.
Thank you so much. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Stephen Levitsky is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies, a professor of government and director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. Dr. Levitsky is one of the foremost scholars of Latin American politics in the country, and he is the author or editor of 12 books on politics across the region. In 2018, Dr. Levitsky and his co-author, Daniel Ziblatt, distilled their understanding of democratic and authoritarian regimes into the book How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller that has been published in 25 different languages. Last year, Drs. Levitsky and Ziblatt teamed up again to write Tyranny of the Minority, the subject of tonight's talk. Together, these books have had a dramatic impact on the general public's understanding of the political movements transforming politics in the United States and across the globe. Dr. Levitsky, on behalf of the Center for the Humanities and the Hanley Democracy Center, I welcome you.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? So thank you to Phil and to Greg and to Christina and to Ori, or she, and the Hanley Center, the Center for Humanities. It is a terrific honor to speak in the Stanford Lecture Series. It's also really cool to come down from Boston where it's freaking snowing and enjoy the weather here. So it took me about 4 seconds to say yes to this particular invitation. Thank you. So the United States is experiencing what political scientists call democratic backsliding. All leading global indices of democracy register a decline for the United States since 2016. Just take one example. Freedom House's Global Democracy Index scores all countries every year from a low of 0, which presumably North Korea, to 100. I think there are 3 countries, mostly Scandinavian, who get a score of 100. 10 years ago, the U.S. got a score of 92. Pretty respectable, solidly democratic, on par with Japan and Italy and the UK and Canada. Today, the U.S. score is 83. Still democratic, but tied with Panama and Romania and below Argentina. That may seem shocking to some of you, but when you have widespread efforts to restrict access to the ballot, when you have violent threats, widespread violent threats against election workers, against elected officials, against prosecutors, against judges, and when you have an attempt by an incumbent president to overturn an election, you fall to the point where Freedom House considers you less democratic than Argentina, because that doesn't happen in Argentina. Now, this was not supposed to happen. Social scientists had discovered two seemingly rock-solid facts about democracies. First of all, rich democracies never die. The wealthiest democracies ever to break down, Argentina and Hungary, had per capita GDPs of about $17,000 in today's dollars. The United States is 4 times richer than that. The second seemingly rock-solid fact about democracies is that old democracies never die. No democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. So even if we date the birth of U.S. democracy in 1965, when we achieved full suffrage, U.S. democracy was still over 50 years old when Donald Trump was elected. So we ought to be safe. All historical data suggests that we ought to be safe. We're not safe. In our book, Tyranny, the Minority, Daniel Ziblatt and I try to understand or try to explain why we're not safe. And we argue that the United States is undergoing an unprecedented transition, a transition to a truly multiracial democracy in which a majority ethnic group loses its dominant status. That's a very big deal, and it is unprecedented. That transformation, we argue, has triggered an authoritarian reaction among a minority of Americans. But that, I want to suggest, is only part of the story. Our Constitution is exacerbating the problem by empowering that authoritarian minority. I'm going to talk about both parts of the problem today. All right, so over the last 50, 60 years, the United States has been gradually building a multiracial democracy. It's worth stepping back and looking at some of the changes that have occurred over my lifetime. And I'm not that old. The number of Black and Latino members of Congress has more than quadrupled since my bar mitzvah. From 28, I take that as the key benchmark, adulthood. Number of Black and Latino representatives in Congress has more than quadrupled from 28 in 1980 to 114 today. The number of Latinos in Congress has increased from 9 to 52. The number of African Americans in Congress has increased from 19 to 62. For the first time in the history of this republic, the percentage of African Americans in Congress equals the percentage of African Americans in the overall population. In 1965, all 9 Supreme Court justices were white men. Today, 4 of 9 justices are white men. Only 6 of 9 are white. Public opinion has also changed dramatically over the last 40 or 50 years. For the first time ever, a majority of Americans consistently embrace diversity and racial equality, the bedrock principles, I want to suggest, of multiracial democracy. So in 1980, again, right around the time of my bar mitzvah, most Americans opposed laws banning discrimination in home sales. So most Americans opposed laws that said, oh, you can't refuse to sell your house to somebody of a different race or ethnicity. Today, 80% of Americans support such laws. More than 80% of Americans consistently agree with the statement today that the growing diversity of our society makes America a better place to live. 60, 64, 65%. And recent polls show that more than 60% of Americans think our schools should in fact teach about America's history of racism, even if it makes kids uncomfortable. This is a big deal. For the first time in our 250-year history, America has a multiracial Democratic majority, small d Democratic majority. But the transition to multiracial democracy faces 2 big challenges: an authoritarian reaction and a constitution that is arguably amplifying that reaction. I want to take each of these in turn. First of all, Political parties that are committed to democracy, are what the Spanish political scientist Juan Linz called loyal Democrats. Again, loyal, small d Democrats. Loyal Democrats must do three basic things. They must accept the results of elections, win or lose. They must unambiguously reject political violence. And they must break completely with anti-democratic extremists. First two are pretty straightforward. I want to spend a second on this third point, breaking with extremists. Individual leaders, whether they be politicians or generals, individual leaders can never kill a democracy on their own. They need accomplices among mainstream politicians. They need what Linz called semi-loyal Democrats. Semi-loyal Democrats are sometimes hard to pick out in the crowd. They look, they talk, they dress a lot like ordinary politicians. The key difference, though, between loyal Democrats and semi-loyal Democrats is how they respond to authoritarian threats on their own flank, on their own side. When anti-democratic forces emerge, and they do in all societies from time to time, when anti-democratic forces emerge in their own camp, loyal Democrats, small d Democrats, do three things. First of all, they publicly condemn anti-democratic behavior, even if it's their allies who are doing it. Secondly, they expel anti-democratic extremists from their ranks. They refuse to nominate them. They refuse to appoint them. They refuse to support their candidacies. And crucially, third, loyal Democrats are willing to join forces with pro-democratic rivals from the other side of the political spectrum in order to isolate and defeat anti-democratic forces. This is Liz Cheney. It's Adam Kinzinger. Semi-loyal Democrats do none of these things. Rather than publicly repudiate anti-democratic behavior on their own flank, they will downplay it. They will justify it through whataboutism, or they'll simply remain silent. Rather than expelling anti-democratic extremists, semi-loyalists tolerate them, accommodate them, eventually work with them. And crucially, semi-loyalists refuse to work with anti-democratic rivals, with ideological rivals, with people on the other side of the aisle, in order to defeat anti-democratic extremists, even when democracy is on the line. Now, the tragedy of semi-loyal politicians is that these guys aren't trying to kill democracy. They're just ordinary run-of-the-mill politicians trying to get ahead. They're trying to stave off a primary challenge, or they're trying to become Speaker of the House, or they're trying just to avoid the wrath of the base. But semi-loyal behavior, whatever its causes, strengthens anti-democratic forces. When mainstream politicians, when mainstream parties tolerate or condone anti-democratic extremists, it normalizes them. Major media outlets then begin to treat them like ordinary politicians, cover them like ordinary politicians. Donors who once shunned them decide now it's okay maybe to fund their campaigns. Leading consultants and pollsters start returning their phone calls, and of course voters begin to take them more seriously. I want to suggest that a clear lesson, at least that I take, from democratic breakdowns in Europe in the 1920s and the 1930s, and from democratic breakdowns in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, is that when mainstream political parties of the center left or the center right begin to flirt with anti-democratic extremists, democracies invariably get into trouble. Why am I saying this? Because since 2020, the Republican Party has violated all three of these core principles of loyal democratic behavior. First of all, Republican leaders violated the cardinal rule of democracy when they failed to unambiguously accept the results of the 2020 election. Not only was Donald Trump the first sitting president in U.S. history to try to overturn an election, but the bulk of the Republican Party leadership went along with it. A never-Trump conservative group called the Republican Accountability Project evaluated the public statements of all 261 Republican members of Congress, House and Senate, to see whether in their public statements they cast doubt on the legitimacy of the 2020 election. 86% of them cast doubt on the results of the 2020 election. This is crucial. Democracy requires that political parties know how to lose. When a major political party cannot accept defeat, democracy is in trouble. Secondly, an unusual number of Republican politicians have begun to flirt with political violence. They embraced individuals who threatened or even killed Black Lives Matter protesters. The McCloskeys, remember the McCloskeys from St. Louis, the couple that drew their guns on peaceful protesters? They were given a prominent speaking role in the 2020 Republican convention. Marjorie Taylor Greene nominated remember Kyle Rittenhouse? Nominated for a congressional gold medal by Marjorie Taylor Greene. And during the 2022 campaign, the New York Times found more than 100 Republican ads in which candidates brandished or fired semi-automatic weapons. I can think of no other major political party in any other established democracy in the world in which candidates so openly embrace violence. But the most dangerous feature of the contemporary Republican Party is its refusal to break with anti-democratic forces. Democratic semi-loyalty is now pervasive in the Republican Party, far more than when we wrote How Democracies Die 6 years ago. Republican leaders like McConnell, McCarthy, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, they knew that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. In fact, many of them were privately quite troubled by his anti-democratic behavior in the wake of the 2020 election. But they enabled it anyway. They protected Trump by refusing to impeach and convict him. They blocked creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th uprising. And crucially, they will all back Trump in 2024, even if he's convicted of trying to overturn an election. It doesn't have to be this way. Think about Brazil. Brazil elected a Trump-like figure, a guy named Jair Bolsonaro, in 2018, 2 years after Trump was elected. U.S. press liked to call him the Trump of the tropics. Bolsonaro was a big fan of Trump, copied Trump in many of his antics, and in many ways governed like Trump, and governed pretty badly. As a result, like Trump, he was narrowly defeated in his effort to be reelected in 2022. And like Trump, he tried in somewhat different ways, but tried to overturn the results of the election. But that's where the parallel histories diverge, because Bolsonaro's allies, his conservative political allies, refused to go along with it. All of Brazil's leading right-wing politicians recognized the result of the election on election night. All of them, the president of Congress, leading senators, leading governors. So the McConnells, the McCarthys, the DeSantises, all of them in Brazil accepted the results of the election on election night. Brazil had a January 6th-like event on January 8th, 2023. Not only did protesters storm the Congress, they stormed the presidential palace and the Supreme Court as well. So all three branches of government. But conservative politicians in Brazil forcefully condemned the insurrection and led the push for a congressional investigation into it. Nobody downplayed it. Nobody condoned it. Nobody defended it. Nobody defended the hostages who were convicted of insurrection. Finally, whereas the Republicans will nominate Trump this year despite his coup attempt, despite his increasingly open embrace of authoritarianism, in Brazil, Bolsonaro has been barred by the courts from political participation for 8 years, and very few politicians have rallied to his defense. So whereas Trump remains a serious contender for the presidency, Jair Bolsonaro is now an increasingly marginal figure in Brazilian politics. So there was another path. There was another path. Republican leaders simply didn't follow. Now, I'm not saying that all Republicans are authoritarian. This is an important point. Many, many Republicans all over the country remain committed small d Democrats. But Republican leaders' refusal to unambiguously accept the results of a presidential election, their increased flirtation with political violence, and their embrace of an openly authoritarian candidate are pretty clear evidence of a party that is no longer fully committed to democratic rules of the game. I Don't know how else to conclude. All right, so why the hell is this happening? Democracy cannot remain stable if one of two major parties is not fully committed to democracy. But how in the world would an established party, a party that has been around competing in elections for more than 150 years, suddenly go off the rails and turn away from democracy? It's actually a pretty rare event. In our book, we looked around for other comparable cases and found very few of them. So this is an unusual development. We argue, and there's lots of room for debate and discussion here, but we argue that it is a fear of losing. For democracy to work, parties have to be able to tolerate defeat, have to be able to tolerate losing. And to tolerate losing, parties and party leaders and their constituents have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. When political parties or their supporters perceive losing to pose an existential threat, they radicalize and sometimes turn against democracy. Closest example I could find was Southern Democrats after the Civil War in the United States. Reconstruction, of course, was this country's first experiment with multiracial democracy, multiracial male democracy. It brought widespread and almost immediate black enfranchisement. African Americans were an outright majority or a near majority in every Southern state, so their enfranchisement terrified Southern Democrats and many of their supporters. Not only did black enfranchisement threaten the Southern Democrats' electoral dominance, it threatened the entire racial order. For many Southern whites, it felt like an existential threat. So the Democrats abandoned any pretense of democracy. As one North Carolina Democrat declared, we cannot outnumber the Negroes, and so we must either out-cheat, out-count, or out-shoot them. And that's what they did. Democrats used a combination of violent terrorism and election fraud to seize power across the U.S. South. They then entrenched themselves in power for nearly a century by using poll taxes, literacy tests, and other measures to effectively wipe out African American voting rights. Unwilling to lose, Southern Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population and ushered in nearly a century of authoritarian rule in the South. We fear that something similar is happening in the Republican Party today. The roots of this phenomenon lie in the civil rights reform of the 1960s, America's second experiment with multiracial democracy. Civil rights revolution generated a fair amount of resentment among white voters, especially in the South, which had long been overwhelmingly Democratic. The Republicans, going back to the 1960s, were very much the minority party at the time. Ever since the New Deal, the Republicans had been the minority party. But white resentment over civil rights gave the Republicans an opportunity to expand their base. That's what parties do. They look for ways to expand their base. So beginning with Goldwater, continuing with Nixon, continuing with Reagan, the Republicans very self-consciously appealed to racially conservative and eventually white Christian voters in what came to be known as the Southern strategy. That strategy worked. The Republicans, over the course of a little more than a generation, about 30, 40 years, Southern whites flipped from being overwhelmingly Democrats, almost homogeneously Democrats, to being overwhelmingly Republicans. The Republicans became the party of white Christians, of self-identified white Christians. They won the white vote in every presidential election after 1964, continuing to this day. And because the U.S. electorate was still overwhelmingly white Christian in the last quarter of the 20th century, that allowed the Republicans to become America's majority party. The Republican Party won every presidential election between 1968 and 1988, with the exception of the Watergate election. It's a pretty good run. But the strategy eventually ran into trouble, because at roughly the same time that the Republicans were becoming America's white Christian party, America was becoming less white and less Christian. The percentage of Americans who identified as white and Christian fell from 80% in 1976 to 43% in 2016. That posed two threats to Republicans. The first, and maybe less fundamental, was an electoral threat. It became increasingly difficult in the early part of the 21st century for an overwhelmingly white Christian party to win national majority, which is why the Republicans have won the national popular vote one time since Taylor Swift was born. 1989, I think. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 55% of the white vote, translated that into a landslide 44-state victory. 32 years later, 2012, Mitt Romney won a whopping 59% of the white vote, still lost the election. When Republican leaders realized that they were winning the white vote but losing the American vote, they started to panic. But the problem went way beyond losing elections. For much of the Republican rank and file, the rise of multiracial democracy felt like an existential threat. White Christians were not just any group. For 2 centuries, they occupied the top rung of each of this country's social, economic, cultural, political hierarchies. They were the politicians, they were the judges, they were the CEOs, the university presidents, the football coaches, the newspaper editors, the talking heads on TV. For 2 centuries, all the way up through my bar mitzvah, every single president and vice president, every single House Speaker, every single Senate Majority Leader, every single Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, every single Federal Reserve Chair, every single governor, every single Fortune 500 CEO, every flippin' Miss America was white. 200 years. All that is now ending. It's ending rapidly. It's ending relentlessly. It's ending right before our eyes. We see it in the quadrupling in the number of Black and Latino members of Congress. We see it in the rapidly growing presence of non-white and multiracial families on TV screens, movie screens, in ads. We see it in mounting societal pushback against acts of racism. Think of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we see it in challenges in classrooms, in newsrooms, to historical narratives that downplay or ignore America's racist past. We are living through an unprecedented assault on this country's racial hierarchies. But when your group has been sitting at the top of those social hierarchies for a couple centuries, challenges to that hierarchy can feel threatening. Losing one's dominant social status can feel like an existential threat. Many Trump voters, not all, many Trump voters feel like they're losing more than just elections. They feel like they're losing their country. They feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that sense of loss has pushed many, not all, rank-and-file Republicans toward extremism. In a poll taken a couple years ago by the American Enterprise Institute, or sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, 56% of Republicans agreed with the statement that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to stop it. 56%. Halftime. Now, the Republicans' radicalization would pose less of a threat if the United States were like other democracies, where electoral majorities govern. MAGA, Trump, Trumpism have never represented a majority of Americans. Never, not for one day. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, solid majorities, consistent majorities of Americans embrace diversity and racial equality. They support the expansion of voting rights. They supported Black Lives Matter. For the first time ever in the 21st century, this country has a multiracial Democratic majority. Small d, Democratic majority. But that multiracial Democratic majority has hurled itself against some of the world's most powerful counter-majoritarian institutions. Now, let me be very clear here, especially for those interested in political science. Counter-majoritarian institutions sound boring, but they're really critical to democracy. They're essential to democracy. Modern democracy absolutely requires the protection of minority rights. Not everything can or should be up for grabs in elections. As Justice Robert Jackson famously put it, some domains must be placed beyond the reach of majorities. Beyond the reach of majorities. Two domains, I want to suggest, must be kept beyond the reach of majorities. First is civil liberties. Civil liberties like the right to vote, free speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, have to be protected from the whims of electoral or legislative majorities. Pretty basic. Second domain that has to be kept beyond the reach of majorities is the democratic process itself. Elected governments can't be able to use popular or parliamentary majorities to entrench themselves in power. For example, by changing the rules of the game to weaken their opponents or to undermine fair competition. This is the sort of tyranny of the majority that we saw in Chavez's Venezuela, that we see with Orban in Hungary, that we almost saw with Netanyahu's judicial reform in Israel. So we need mechanisms. Democracy needs mechanisms to protect the democratic system from majorities that would subvert it. So civil liberties and the right to fair competition are essential minority rights. They are rights that require counter-majoritarian protection. That means institutions like the Bill of Rights, like an independent Supreme Court with judicial review power, and with relatively high barriers to constitutional reform. It has to be hard to change the Constitution. Those are essential counter-majoritarian institutions. But not all counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. And in fact, some of them subvert or undermine democracy. So just as some domains must be kept beyond the reach of majorities, other domains, I want to suggest, must remain within the reach of majorities. Some domains must remain within the reach of majorities. Let me just mention two. One of them is elections. Those with more votes should prevail over those with fewer votes in determining who holds political office. I can think, I'm not a democratic theorist, but I cannot think of a theory of democracy that justifies any other outcome. A second domain that should remain within the realm of majorities is legislation. Those who win elections should govern. Partisan minorities should not be able to permanently veto regular legislation backed by parliamentary majorities, provided, of course, that that legislation doesn't violate basic rights. Institutions that prevent electoral majorities from winning or that prevent parliamentary majorities from governing, I want to suggest, are not essential to democracy and, in fact, are antithetical to democracy. The U.S., as it turns out, has a bunch of these undemocratic counter-majoritarian institutions. Those include the Electoral College, which allows losers of the popular vote to win the presidency, a severely malapportioned Senate, which provides equal representation to all states regardless of their population, the Senate filibuster, which allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation backed by the majority, and a powerful Supreme Court with lifetime tenure for justices, which allows justices appointed in one generation to thwart majorities for generations to come. Now, this sort of excessively counter-majoritarian institution, very often, if you look comparatively, are products of political pacts. Pacts in which relatively powerful, undemocratic forces demand certain protections as a condition for giving up power. We saw this in post-Pinochet Chile. We saw it with the Polish communists in 1989. We saw it with whites in South Africa. We see it, if you're interested, in contemporary Thailand. Now, we don't usually think of our own counter-majoritarian institutions in this way, right? We think of our counter-majoritarian institutions as having been designed by far-sighted founders as part of a carefully crafted blueprint for a republic. But that's a myth. Can you say that in DeSantis' form? You can say that, right? Okay. That's a myth. The framers were very smart, very experienced politicians, but they were not trying to design the perfect republic. They were trying to hold the Union together. The first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, had failed miserably. Insurrections like Shays' Rebellion generated real fears of civil war. And if the fragile Union of 13 states did not hold itself together in 1787, there was a real possibility, or certainly there was a real fear of British or French military intervention. In other words, the new republic was seriously imperiled during the hot summer of 1787. These guys had to forge a constitution that would keep the Union from breaking apart, keep the Union from descending into civil war and maybe succumbing to European domination. Those are high stakes. To do that, to make sure that the Union held together, the framers had to compromise. Madison and Hamilton, two of our most important and admired framers, opposed equal state representation in the Senate. They thought it was terribly undemocratic. But when small states like Delaware threatened to bolt the Union, they had to compromise. Madison didn't like the Electoral College. Madison wanted Congress to elect the president, like in today's European parliamentary democracies. Madison was also sympathetic to the idea of direct election of the president. But Southern slave states rejected direct elections. So the Electoral College ended up being a third best solution after all the other alternatives were voted down in the Constitutional Convention. The filibuster was also not part of the framers' vision of checks and balances. Both Hamilton and Madison opposed supermajority rules for regular legislation. Supermajority rules were not included in the Constitution, at least for regular legislation. They were not included in the original Senate, but rather the filibuster emerged later, over the course of the 19th century, thanks in effect to an oversight by Senate leaders who were cleaning up the chamber's rules. It was an accident. So key counter-majoritarian institutions, the Senate, the Electoral College, were not a product of brilliant or far-sighted leadership. They were a product, understandably, of compromise and improvisation, like in most regime transitions. But whereas pacts in Poland, in South Africa, in Chile were temporary, America's counter-majoritarian institutions became permanent features of the political system. They took root. Those permanent features now threaten our democracy. The concessions made to small states in 1787 built a bias into our political system. It overrepresented sparsely populated territories. So the Electoral College favors sparsely populated territories. The U.S. Senate heavily favors sparsely populated territories. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees, the Supreme Court is also biased towards sparsely populated territories. Now, that rural bias has always been there. It's always been undemocratic. But it never seriously advantaged one political party over another, because for the first 2 centuries of this country, both major parties had urban wings and rural wings. It's only today, it's only in the 21st century, that our parties have split along urban-rural lines. So today, as you all know, the Democrats are overwhelmingly based in the cities and urban centers, and the Republicans are overwhelmingly based in sparsely populated territories. That gives the Republicans, through no fault of their own, it gives the Republicans a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, in the Supreme Court, which allows them to win and hold national power without winning national majorities. Some data that you already know. Republicans have won the popular vote for president once in Taylor Swift's lifetime, once since 1988, yet they've controlled the presidency for most of the 21st century. A popular majority was not enough for Biden to win the presidency. He had to win the popular vote by 4 points. Had he won the presidency by 3 points in the popular vote, Trump would have been reelected. Senate's even more skewed. Senators, as you know, are elected to staggered 6-year terms. 1/3 of the chamber is up for election every 2 years. So it takes 3 elections to fully renovate the Senate, to fully renovate all 100 senators. The Democratic Party has won the overall popular vote in every 6-year cycle since the 1990s. In every 6-year cycle since the 1990s. And yet the Republicans have controlled the Senate for nearly half this period. In recent years, the Democrats have needed to win the popular vote by about 5 points to retain control of the Senate. That means if the Democrats consistently win 51, 52% of the popular vote, the Republicans will control the Senate. Composition of the Supreme Court is also skewed. 4 out of 9 Supreme Court justices were confirmed by senators representing less than half the U.S. population. 3 of them, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Coney Barrett, were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and then confirmed by senators who represented less than half the population. If the popular vote determined who won the presidency and who controlled the Senate, pretty basic stuff, the Supreme Court would likely have a 6-3 liberal majority today. So our institutions increasingly allow those who win fewer votes to govern over those who win more votes. That is minority rule. But the problem I want to suggest goes deeper than that. That's pretty unfair, but the problem is deeper than that. Excessive counter-majoritarianism is beginning, I think, to reinforce authoritarianism in a couple of ways. First of all, counter-majoritarian institutions, excessive counter-majoritarianism, reinforces Republican extremism by shielding the party from competitive pressure. Right? Democratic competition is supposed to work kind of like the market, right? When products don't sell, firms don't make money. When firms don't make money, they face pressure, maybe to change the CEO, to change marketing strategy, to develop better products. In democracies, parties are supposed to win votes. They're supposed to win elections. When parties repeatedly lose elections, they face pressure to adapt and to broaden their appeal so they can win. When Democrats lost 3 consecutive presidential elections in the 1980s, they responded by moving to the center and picking Bill Clinton, a moderate, to be their presidential candidate. That's what parties do when they lose. That process of adaptation when you lose is not happening in the Republican Party today. The Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 elections. They badly underperformed in 2018, in 2020, in 2022. But there has been no significant effort to rethink strategy or to moderate. And that's in part because our institutions give the Republicans an electoral crutch. They don't have to win national majorities. They can wield a heck of a lot of power with 47, 48% of the national vote. So extremism doesn't cost the Republican Party like it would in a fully competitive environment. Despite everything that Trump has done, national power remains tantalizingly within reach for the Republicans. They are very likely to win control of the Senate in 2024 this year. They have a pretty darn good chance of winning the presidency. So why moderate? There's no competitive need. There's also a risk, I think, that excessive counter-majoritarianism will prove self-reinforcing. As Berkeley political scientist Paul Pearson puts it, in politics, power begets power. In 2016, the loser of the popular vote won the presidency. The loser of the popular vote for the Senate won control of the Senate. That president who lost the popular vote and that Senate that lost the popular vote, that Senate majority, then filled 3 Supreme Court seats, forging a powerful right-wing majority out of electoral minorities. The Supreme Court, in turn, has enabled state-level authoritarianism, upholding, for example, gerrymandering schemes that permit minority rule in several state legislatures. And in states like Ohio, North Carolina, Wisconsin, gerrymandered state legislatures have launched a variety of anti-democratic initiatives, including measures making it harder to vote. This is how minority rule can entrench itself. Now, minority rule is a uniquely American problem. In no other established democracy can partisan minorities thwart electoral majorities as consistently or as consequentially as the United States. Why is that the case? Counter-majoritarianism used to be widespread. States in 19th century Europe had all sorts of undemocratic institutions. They had monarchic vetoes, they had indirect elections, they had unelected or badly malapportioned legislatures. They also had, most of them had filibuster-like mechanisms through which parliamentary minorities could thwart majorities. These things were rampant in Europe in the 19th century, so much so that at the time, the US Constitution was super democratic, super progressive. But over the course of the last 100, 120 years, other democracies gradually shed their pre-democratic institutions. Britain, for example, weakened the House of Lords, stripping it of its veto power. Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Portugal got rid of their undemocratic upper chambers. Germany, Austria, Belgium democratized their senates by making them more proportional to the population. Britain, Canada, France, other democracies established cloture rules allowing simple majorities, 51%, to end parliamentary debate, eliminating the possibility of a minority filibuster. All other established democracies on earth imposed either a retirement age or term limits for Supreme Court justices, and every other presidential democracy on earth got rid of its electoral college. Argentina was the last one in 1994. So other democracies across the world, across Europe, even across Latin America, have become more democratic over the last century, eliminating a range of 18th and 19th century institutions that allowed minorities to systematically thwart majorities. Only the United States has retained most of its pre-democratic institutions. So today, the United States is the only presidential democracy in the world with an electoral college. We have the most malapportioned Senate on earth, except for Argentina and Brazil. No other democracy allows a congressional minority to routinely veto legislation backed by a majority. The United States is the only established democracy with lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. Again, every other established democracy has either term limits or retirement age. And finally, among democracies, the U.S. Constitution is, by most measures, the hardest in the world to amend, to change. We need to democratize American democracy. The last chapter of our book, we propose 15 reforms, some constitutional, some not, that would help to ensure simply that electoral majorities win power and govern. That includes establishing a constitutional right to vote, something that exists in most democracies but not here, automatic voter registration, abolishing the electoral college, democratizing the Senate by eliminating the filibuster and giving more populous states greater representation, and establishing term limits for Supreme Court justices. These are not radical reforms. All of them exist in most other democracies. Making it easier to vote, abolishing the electoral college, eliminating the filibuster, ending lifetime tenure on the Supreme Court, all those things would simply bring the United States in line with other established democracies. We forget this sometimes, but Americans have a long tradition of working to make our political system more democratic. Back in 1787, George Washington wrote a letter to his nephew, I think it was his nephew, in which he described the Constitution, the newly written Constitution, as an imperfect document and said that it would require the work of future generations to improve. And future generations of Americans, generation after generation of Americans, did exactly that. From the Bill of Rights, to the expansion of suffrage, to the very important Reconstruction amendments, to the Progressive era reforms, to the Civil Rights era, Americans worked generation after generation to make our political system more democratic. It's only over the last half century that we've simply stopped doing that work. And as a result, America is increasingly becoming a democratic laggard. We need to return to our country's reformist tradition. If we do not, we risk a slide into minority rule. In the meantime, though, we face an imminent authoritarian threat. In 2016, Americans could be forgiven for not knowing that Donald Trump was an autocrat. But now we know. Trump, again, violated the cardinal rule of democracy when he tried to overturn the 2020 election. And he has been very clear, amazingly clear, about what he intends to do if he wins this year. Trump tells us that he will purge the public administration and pack it with loyalists. He's got a 900-page plan, the Heritage Foundation's Project 25, to do it. Trump is telling us that he will use the Justice Department to harass and, if he can, jail his critics. He is telling us that he will try to use the machinery of government to shut down certain media outlets. He is telling us that if there's protest, he will call in the army under the Insurrection Act to repress it. I'm not exaggerating here. I cannot think of another major candidate in competitive elections anywhere in the world since World War II that's been as openly authoritarian as Trump. Hugo Chavez never said anything like this in the campaign. Erdogan and Orban never said this stuff. Even Putin was not this open about his authoritarian ambitions. It is imperative that we build a broad coalition in defense of democracy, one that is much, much broader than anything that we're talking about today. That coalition has to include everyone, from Bernie Sanders and AOC to Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, George Bush, and as many conservative and business figures as we can. I would even strongly consider, nobody's listening to me, but I would strongly consider putting Republicans on Democratic Party tickets in 2024. This has to be an unusually broad coalition. That is not easy to do. Building a broad coalition requires sacrifice. It requires working with people that we have worked against our entire lives. It requires setting aside policy differences, even on issues that we really, really care about. Israel, abortion, the environment. That's a big, big ask. But these are not ordinary times. If we behave as if we are living in ordinary times, we could lose our democracy. We stand at a crossroads today. America will either be a multiracial democracy in the 21st century or it will not be a democracy. Both of those roads lie before us today, and there's no turning back. I'll stop there. Thank you.